Celestine had always thought she knew every corner of their shared life, every secret drawer and hidden thought, until the afternoon she came home early from her sister's baby shower and heard sounds coming from their bedroom that made her freeze in the hallway. She pushed open the door quietly, her heart already knowing what her mind refused to accept. And there was Bartholomew, her husband of 7 years, in a position she had never imagined, completely absorbed in his private moment with a purple silicone device she'd never seen before. He didn't notice her standing there for a full 30 seconds, and when he finally did, the look of horror on his face was almost comical, almost enough to make her laugh if she wasn't already calculating exactly how this moment would define everything that came next. The conversation that followed was a disaster of stammering explanations and defensive accusations, with Bartholomew trying to turn his embarrassment into anger at her for not knocking, as if their bedroom required an appointment. Celestine sat on the edge of their bed, unnaturally calm, listening to him scramble through justifications about exploration and personal freedom, about things he'd been too afraid to share with her. She nodded along, her face a mask of understanding that didn't quite reach her eyes, while inside her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already planning what hurt most wasn't the act itself. She realized as she drove aimlessly through their suburb that evening, but the years of judgment he'd subjected her to, the little comments about her friends, her choices, her body. Bartholomew had built his entire personality around being the straight-laced, conservative one in their relationship, the one who rolled his eyes at her wilder friends, who'd made her feel small for wanting to try new things. Now his hypocrisy sat between them like a third person in their marriage, and Celestine felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. She didn't confront him again that week, instead playing the role of the understanding wife, even suggesting they could explore things together if he wanted. Bartholomew seemed relieved, grateful even, pulling her into awkward hugs and promising they'd work through this together, completely missing the calculation behind her gentle smiles. Meanwhile, Celestine remembered that his biggest networking event of the year was coming up, the annual party he threw for his colleagues and clients, the one he'd been planning for months. Bartholomew worked in commercial real estate, a world of handshakes and golf courses and carefully maintained masculine personas, where image was everything and weakness was death. He'd invited 40 people this year, including his managing partners, Cornelius and Fitzgerald, his biggest client, Mortimer, and every important person he'd been trying to impress for his upcoming promotion. Celestine had always played the perfect hostess at these events, smiling and charming and making sure everyone's drinks stayed full. Practically invisible in her usefulness, this year would be different. She decided as she volunteered to handle all the party planning herself, insisting that Bartholomew focus on preparing his presentation. He was so relieved to have one less thing to worry about that he didn't question her sudden enthusiasm, didn't notice how carefully she was orchestrating every detail. She ordered the catering, arranged the bartender, set up the sound system, and handled the decorations with a meticulousness that would have made Martha Stewart weep the night before the party. Celestine told Bartholomew she'd prepared a special surprise for him, a video montage of their relationship that would play during his speech. He was touched, actually tearing up as he hugged her, telling her how lucky he was to have such a supportive wife, how this promotion would change everything for them. She hugged him back, feeling nothing but the steady beat of her own heart. Calm as a surgeon before an operation, the party started at 7, and by 8 the house was full of Bartholomew's carefully curated guest list, all nursing cocktails and making small talk about interest rates and property values. Celestine moved through the crowd in an emerald dress that made her look elegant and untouchable, making sure everyone was comfortable, laughing at the right jokes. being exactly the woman they all expected her to be. Bartholomew kept catching her eye across the room, giving her grateful smiles. Completely oblivious to what was coming dot at 9 o'clock, Bartholomew clinked his glass and called for everyone's attention, gathering them in the living room for his presentation about the firm's expansion plans. Celestine dimmed the lights and started the projector, watching her husband's confident face as he began his speech, talking about vision and growth and partnership. The slides clicked through right on schedule, charts and graphs and architectural renderings. Everything professional and polished. Then, exactly 12 minutes into his presentation, the screen changed, and suddenly there was Bartholomew in their bedroom, captured in crystal clear high definition from the camera Celestine had hid in their closet. The footage showed everything, every intimate detail, every expression on his face, the purple toy clearly visible in the frame. And the room went completely silent except for the unmistakable sounds coming from the speakers. Bartholomew's face went from confusion to recognition to absolute horror in the span of 3 seconds, and he lunged for the laptop, but Celestine had locked it remotely and the video played on. She'd edited it carefully, making sure it was long enough that everyone understood exactly what they were seeing, but not so long that people could look away or leave. 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, with Bartholomew frantically trying to turn off the projector while his colleagues and clients stood frozen in shock, some covering their mouths, others pulling out their phones. When the screen finally went black, the silence was deafening, broken only by Bartholomew's ragged breathing and the sound of Cornelius slowly setting down his drink. Celestine spoke into that silence, her voice clear and steady, addressing the room as if she were commenting on the weather. I thought you should all know who Bartholomew really is before you promote him to partner, before you trust him with your investments and your careers. She smiled, and it was the scariest thing anyone in that room had ever seen. Cold and satisfied and completely in control, the exodus started immediately, with Mortimer leading the charge toward the door, followed by the managing partners and everyone else who could get their coats fast enough. Bartholomew tried to stop them, his voice cracking as he attempted explanations that died in his throat, reaching for arms that pulled away from his touch. Within 10 minutes, the house was empty except for the two of them. Standing in the wreckage of his career and their marriage, Bartholomew turned on her then, his face purple with rage and humiliation, screaming about lawsuits and revenge and how she'd destroyed him. Celestine let him yell, watching him with the same detached calm she'd maintained all evening, waiting for him to run out of steam. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, she told him she'd already filed for divorce that morning, that she'd been documenting his financial indiscretions for months, and that her lawyer was very interested in several irregularities she'd found in his client accounts. The color drained from his face as he realized she'd been planning this far longer than he'd imagined, that the video was just the opening move in a much larger game. Celestine picked up her purse and jacket, stepping over discarded napkins and half-full glasses, pausing at the door to deliver her final line. You spent 7 years making me feel inadequate, Bartholomew. 7 years of judgment and criticism while hiding your own secrets. And I want you to know that every person in this room tonight will remember this moment for the rest of their lives. She walked out into the cool night air, leaving him standing alone in their living room, surrounded by the ruins of everything he'd built. Her car was already packed, her new apartment already waiting, and as she drove away, she felt something like joy blooming in her chest, sharp and bright and entirely her own. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, just as Celestine had planned. By Monday morning, the video had circulated through Bartholomew's entire professional network, shared in private messages and whispered about in conference rooms across the city. The managing partners called an emergency meeting and Bartholomew's promotion was not only denied, but his position at the firm became untenable, forcing him into a resignation that was really a firing dressed up with corporate language. Mortimer pulled his accounts immediately, followed by 3 other major clients who decided they couldn't trust someone with such poor judgment. The commercial real estate world was smaller than most people realized, and gossip traveled fast through its corridors of power, meaning Bartholomew's reputation preceded him everywhere he tried to land. Celestine watched it all unfold from a distance, reading the updates her friends sent with the same detached interest one might have for a mildly interesting news story about strangers. Bartholomew tried to fight back, hiring a lawyer to sue her for invasion of privacy and emotional distress. But Celestine's attorney was better prepared and had documentation of everything. They had emails proving Bartholomew had been embezzling small amounts from client accounts, records of his affairs with 2 different women over the past 3 years, and testimony from neighbors about his verbal bust that they'd overheard through shared walls. The lawsuit died quietly, and Bartholomew was left with nothing but legal bills he couldn't afford and a reputation that preceded him like a toxic cloud. Celestine's friends worried about her, expecting to find her broken or consumed by regret, but instead they found her lighter than she'd been in years. She'd started her own consulting business, something she'd always wanted to do, but Bartholomew had discouraged, saying it wasn't practical or professional enough. Within 6 months, she had more clients than she could handle, working with small businesses to streamline their operations. Finding genuine joy in work that felt meaningful, the divorce was finalized with surprising speed. Bartholomew, too defeated to fight over assets he knew he'd lose anyway. Celestine got the house, which she immediately sold, along with most of their joint investments, while Bartholomew moved into a studio apartment on the wrong side of town and took a job selling insurance for a fraction of his former salary. Sometimes she'd hear updates about him through mutual acquaintances, how he'd gained weight, how he'd started drinking too much, how he'd become a cautionary tale people told at dinner parties. She felt no guilt about what she'd done, no late-night regrets or moments of wondering if she'd gone too far. Bartholomew had built his life on judgment and hypocrisy, on making her feel small while hiding his own vulnerabilities, and she'd simply held up a mirror to show everyone who he really was. The fact that the reflection destroyed him wasn't her responsibility. It was the natural consequence of living a lie for so long that the truth became explosive. A year after the party, Celestine ran into Fitzgerald at a coffee shop, and he looked uncomfortable, as if he might pretend not to see her. But she approached him directly, asking how he'd been with genuine curiosity rather than malice, and he relaxed slightly, admitting that the firm had actually benefited from Bartholomew's departure once they'd uncovered the full extent of his misconduct. They talked for 20 minutes, and by the end he'd asked if she'd be interested in consulting for them on a project. Acknowledging that she'd clearly always been the brains behind Bartholomew's success, she took the job and excelled at it, proving that her instincts and insights were sharper than anyone had given her credit for when she'd been playing the supporting role. The partners started referring other clients to her, and soon she was making more money than Bartholomew ever had, building a reputation that was entirely her own. Sometimes she'd think about that afternoon when she'd found him, how that single moment had detonated her entire life, and she'd feel grateful rather than angry, thankful for the catalyst that had forced her to stop accepting less than she deserved. Bartholomew, meanwhile, had become a ghost, rarely seen and never mentioned except as a punchline or a warning. Someone told Celestine he'd moved to a different state, trying to start over where nobody knew his story, but she doubted geography would be enough to outrun what he'd become. The internet never forgot, and his name was permanently attached to his humiliation. a digital scarlet letter that would follow him wherever he went. 3 years after the party, Celestine attended a wedding where she unexpectedly saw Cornelius, who'd been one of Bartholomew's mentors and biggest supporters. She braced herself for coldness or accusation, but instead he pulled her aside and told her something that surprised her. He said that Bartholomew had been heading toward a much bigger disaster, that the firm had been investigating irregularities for months, and that what she'd done had actually prevented him from stealing significantly more money and destroying more lives. Celestine thanked him, but didn't feel vindicated by his words, because she hadn't done it to save anyone or expose financial crimes. She'd done it purely for herself. The revenge had been personal and specific, designed to hurt Bartholomew in exactly the way he'd hurt her, by exposing his carefully constructed facade to the people whose opinions he valued most. That it had uncovered other wrongdoing was coincidence, not justice. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that distinction. She'd started dating again, carefully this time, with clearer boundaries and a much sharper sense of her own worth. The men she chose now were different from Bartholomew, more genuine and less concerned with appearances, willing to be vulnerable without weaponizing that vulnerability against her. She told them about her divorce, though not the details, and they seemed to understand that she'd been through something that had fundamentally changed her, made her both harder and somehow more open at the same time, sometimes late at night, usually after a few glasses of wine. Celestine would think about that party and wonder if she'd become someone she didn't recognize. She'd destroyed a man's entire life with calculated precision, had planned his humiliation down to the minute, and had felt satisfaction rather than horror watching it unfold. But then she remembered the years of small cruelties, the constant criticism, the way he'd made her question her own reality. And the doubt would fade, replaced by the certainty that some people only learn through consequences. And Bartholomew had finally met his. The revenge had cost her too, in ways she hadn't fully anticipated at the time. Some friends had pulled away, uncomfortable with the brutality of what she'd done, unable to reconcile it with the gentle person they thought they knew. Her family had been horrified when they'd heard the full story, her mother crying on the phone about how she'd raised her better than this, her father grimly silent in a way that hurt more than words. Celestine had lost relationships she'd valued, burned bridges she couldn't rebuild. And there were moments when she wondered if the price had been too high, but mostly she felt free, unburdened by the weight of pretending to be someone she wasn't, liberated from the constant low-grade anxiety of living with someone who used her vulnerabilities as weapons. The revenge had been a line in the sand, a declaration that she would not accept being diminished. And while the method might have been extreme, the message was one she'd needed to send as much for herself as for Bartholomew. She'd discovered she was capable of ruthlessness when pushed far enough, and rather than frightening her, that knowledge felt like power. 5 years after the party, Celestine had built a life that bore no resemblance to the one she'd had with Bartholomew. She'd moved to a different neighborhood, cultivated new friendships, grown her business into something that required actual employees and an office with her name on the door. She rarely thought about him anymore, and when she did, it was with the vague curiosity one might feel about a character from a book read long ago. Interesting, but no longer relevant to her present reality. She heard through the grapevine that Bartholomew had married again, some woman he'd met online who didn't know his history, and Celestine felt a flicker of pity for her that surprised her with its genuineness. She hoped he'd learned something, hoped he'd changed enough that some other woman wouldn't have to destroy him to save herself, but she doubted it. People like Bartholomew rarely evolved. They just found new audiences who hadn't seen their act before. And eventually the cycle would repeat. The revenge itself had become a story Celestine told selectively. usually to women who were trapped in similar situations, who needed to know that leaving was possible and that they didn't have to go quietly. She never encouraged them to do what she'd done, but she also never apologized for it, presenting it as one option among many, a nuclear choice that had worked for her specific situation. Some were inspired, others horrified. And a few seemed to understand that sometimes the only way to break free from someone who won't let you go is to make staying together more painful than letting go. Looking back, Celestine could trace the trajectory of her transformation to that single afternoon, that moment of discovery that had shattered her illusions and forced her to choose between accepting betrayal or fighting back. She'd chosen to fight, and while the weapons she'd selected might have been unconventional, they'd been effective, surgically dismantling Bartholomew's life with the same precision he'd used to diminish hers. The symmetry of it satisfied something deep in her, a sense of cosmic balance that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with consequences. She'd become someone who understood that kindness and strength weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be compassionate without being a doormat, fierce without being cruel. The revenge had taught her the limits of her own mercy, shown her that there were lines she wouldn't let anyone cross without retaliation, and that knowledge had made her both more careful about who she let into her life and more confident in her ability to protect herself when those choices proved wrong. Bartholomew existed now only as a footnote in her history, a chapter that had been painful but ultimately instructive, teaching her lessons about herself she couldn't have learned any other way. The party had been the climax of their story, the moment when she'd taken back her power and shown him that underestimating her had been his biggest mistake. Everything that came after was just epilogue. The slow dissolution of a man who'd built himself on sand and discovered too late that the foundation couldn't hold. Celestine never regretted it, never wished she'd handled things differently or shown more mercy. Bartholomew had made his choices and she'd made hers, and if his had led to humiliation and ruin, while hers had led to freedom and sack,